Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. I just made this entire video, and unfortunately there was a problem with the recording software, and I had to throw the whole thing out. So I'm doing it again. So everything I'm about to tell you, I just told you, except you'll never hear it. Alright, so we did a video a few months ago on the seeds of tactical destruction. What are the seeds of tactical destruction? That's the things that are wrong with a position that tell you that you might be able to look for a tactic. Now, when we're talking about a position, we must mean the opponent's position. Because if you're the one looking for the tactic, he's the one who has the problems with this position. That's why I call them the seeds of tactical destruction, because it's something wrong with your position that says your opponent might have a tactic. So if you're looking for problems with your opponent's position, it's his seeds, not your seeds, his seeds of tactical destruction. If it's wrong with your position, then you might allow the tactic, it's your seeds. Now, according to Steinitz's rule, if you have something wrong with your position, then your opponent has the right to look for a tactic. That doesn't mean it's there. On the other hand, if there's no seeds in your position, according to Steinitz's rule, there can't be a tactic. You can't make something out of nothing. So unless your opponent has seeds of tactical destruction in his position, you're wasting your time looking for tactics. Okay, now there's tactics where you win material, and then there's mate tactics. Well, mate tactics have very easy seeds. The seeds on mate tactics are that you're controlling enough squares around the opponent's king so that you have possible checkmates. So seeds of tactical destructions with regard to mating attacks are pretty easy, especially if you're doing a puzzle that tells you it's a mating attack. Then you could pretty much just look around the opponent's king and say, how do I get there? It's very easy to use seeds for tactics that are known mating tactics. Now, if you have a position that says white to play and win, and it turns out the win is through a mating tactic, then you have to notice, oh, maybe the way to win this game is because I can control these squares around the opponent's king. But if they tell you it's a mate, then you know that that's the seed. All right, so what are the common types of seeds besides squares around the king? Well, it could be something like a loose piece. This is known as Nunn's dictum, LPDO, loose pieces drop off. What's a loose piece? Well, a loose piece is one that's not guarded, but it's also one that's kind of vulnerable and subject to attack. Let's look at the opening position of a game, which we have in front of us here. The only loose pieces on the board are the rooks. All the other 28 pieces on the board are guarded. But the rooks aren't really loose here because in this particular position at the start of the game, it's very difficult to get to the opponent's rooks. So I wouldn't think of these rooks as being loose pieces, even though they're unguarded. But we'll see some examples of that. Now, I call these the seeds of tactical destruction. And this idea that there has to be something wrong with the position in order for something for a tactic to occur has long been known. I certainly wasn't the one who came up with that. I'm sure even Steinitz might not have been the first one. I have an entire book on that in front of me. It's called Chess Tactics Antenna by Emanuel Niemann. And the subtitle is Know When and Where to Look for Winning Combinations. All right, so he needs to also have something like this. And he uses the word signal. And I'll read you what he says. A signal is a weakness in the opponent's position. Okay, so his signal and my seeds of tactical destruction are exactly the same thing. Why do I use so many words and he just uses one? Well, the problem with the word signal is there's lots of things that could be signals in chess. You could have a signal that your opponent doesn't understand the opening. You could have a signal that your opponent's going to be playing this game too slow and he's going to get into time trouble. You could have a signal that your opponent is nervous. There's lots of signals that you get during a game. So just calling it a signal doesn't seem to have enough information in the name. That's why I called it a seed of tactical destruction. I could have just called it a seed, but I wanted to say it's tactical destruction. Tactical because it's where you can win material or checkmate, and destruction because it's something that can allow your position to be destroyed, that you get a tactic against you, because it's not a signal of something good, it's a signal of something bad. It's a seed of something bad, so it's a seed of tactical destruction. That's why I used all those words. and Mr. Neiman uses just signal. Now one of his first examples is the famous game Christensen-Karpov. So let's take a look at this game. Okay, Christensen played d4, Karpov was black, he played knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, that's called the Queen's Indian, a3, stopping bishop b4 lines, would make it similar to a Nimzo, bishop a6, kind of a subtle move saying to white, guard this pawn before I put my bishop on the long diagonal. I'm willing to make you do something like either block your bishop or move your queen. Christensen moves the queen. Karpov says, okay, I've done my job. I made the queen abandon the d4 square. You might ask, why would you want to force the queen to develop the c2 anyway? And black's idea is, well, I can control e4, but I'm weakening d4 here. Does it work? Well, let's see. Christensen plays knight c3. Karpov says c5. This is the whole idea. Attack the square the queen's not guarding anymore. Christensen says, I'm going to get the big center. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, consistent with hitting the knight on d4. Knight takes c6, bishop takes, bishop to f4. And now Karpov plays a move that Stockfish 12 says is the best move. Let's show you. We'll move it up a little. Best move for black here. Knight h5. But notice the evaluation is around 0.5. 0.5 is more than a normal advantage. So we could see that modern grandmasters probably won't play this line for black if they think they're down by 0.5. So knight h5. Now the bishop is loose. The knight is loose. So clearly it's white's turn. He has to save the bishop. Christensen plays bishop e3. And now Karpov would like to bring the knight back into the game. He decides maybe I'd like to bring it into f4. So he plays bishop d6. Okay, but bishop d6 is also a loose piece. So now black has two loose pieces. All right, well, let's look at a little geometry. What are the ways to attack those two pieces? Well, we can attack the bishop with a knight or with a pawn. We could attack it with a rook or a queen along the d file. We can attack the knight with a rook along the fifth rank. We can attack the knight with a pawn with an AWL, attack with something worth less. We could attack the knight with a bishop or a queen along this diagonal, bishop e2, queen d1, queen e2. Okay, now what we're looking for is an overlap between those two ideas. Is there any way that we can use a piece that can attack both the knight and the bishop? Well, it turns out there is. We can put the queen on d1. That attacks the bishop with the function where the queen moves like a rook, and it attacks the knight with the function where the queen moves like a bishop. How can black save both pieces? Well, can he move the bishop and guard the knight? No. Can he move the knight and guard the bishop? No. Can he move a piece like the queen and guard both pieces? No. Can he counterattack somehow and attack one of white's pieces? Looks like white's pieces are all pretty good shape here. If he brings the knight here and attacks this pawn, does that do anything? No. Queen takes d6, still wins a piece. If he brings the bishop in and attacks the knight, does that win anything? No. He can double his pawns, but that's hardly compensation for losing an entire knight. So how does Karpov save his piece? Well, the answer is he can't. And even though he's world champion, this game was played in... Oh, no, he wasn't world champion at the time. He was former world champion in 1993. Even though he can't save... it's only move 12 of the game, Karpov resigned. And this is an excellent example of Nunn's dictum. Loose pieces drop off. Loose piece, subject to attack. White wins. Okay, so I came up with a couple other puzzles in my library that we could look at. Let's take a look at some of them. So we're looking for seeds of tactical destruction. Examine, percent 35. Okay. So, black has just developed the knight, and he's attacking the pawn on c5. And white wants to know, right now white is up a pawn. White has 7 pawns, black only has 6. He could give back the pawn, or he could try to save it. But what are all the ways of saving it? He can play knight e4. He can play knight a4. He can play b4. Well, clearly knight e4 is not safe. Knight e4, knight takes e4. Knight a4 might be a candidate move. Maybe white could play that. It's at least under consideration. How about b4? Is b4 safe? Let's look at the seeds of tactical destruction for white if he does that. If white plays b4, that pawn was guarding the knight on c3. So now, not only is the knight loose on c3, but it also opens the diagonal to the rook, which is loose on a1 and pinnable by a bishop or a queen along the diagonal between the knight on c3 and the rook on a1. The rook on h1 is also loose. The bishop on c4 is loose. All right, so those are all seeds. Can black take advantage of that? Well, it looks like he might be able to. He's got a bishop that could get a discovered attack along the dark square diagonal a1 to h8. So moving this knight on f6 becomes a candidate move. Let's pick a random square. Let's say he plays knight e8. Now he's got the knight that's loose pinned to the rook that's loose. Does that work? Well, no, because white can just guard the knight. He could play bishop to b2, guard the knight. Bishop d2 guards the knight. King to c2 guards the knight. King d2 guards the knight. Okay, so a random knight move doesn't work. How about doing something more with the knight, like maybe bringing the knight up and attacking more pieces? Now, if you're one of those people who says, I can't do that because if I bring the knight up, he can just take it, then you're not looking far enough. That's a quiescence error, because maybe you'll get more than what you're giving up here. So knight d5 and knight e4 are candidate moves. Let's look at knight d5 first. Okay, well, if white plays knight takes d5 and wins the knight, we don't just stop there and say we lost the knight. Black will get an entire rook on a1. White will get a check. Knight c7 doesn't trap the rook. And black will get out of check. And black has won the exchange for a pawn. Winning the exchange doesn't mean coming out ahead in a trade. It means getting a rook for a bishop or a knight. It doesn't mean getting a queen for a rook or a pawn for a bishop for a queen or any of those things. It just means getting a rook for a bishop or a knight. So here, black has gotten a rook, but he's given up a knight and a pawn. The problem for the knight d5, though, is that white doesn't have to take with the knight. He can take with the bishop. And you might say, well, why would he want to do that? He's not attacking the pawn, and when the bishop attacks the knight, he's also attacking the rook. Well, the problem is you just sacrificed the knight, and now you're getting a knight back, but white can save his rook, which also happens to guard this pawn over here. So the net result is you've sacrificed a knight to win a knight, but you haven't gained anything. So that's not a tactic. A tactic is where you're winning material or checkmating by force, and here, playing knight d5 is an attempt at a tactic. It's a threat, but it doesn't work. White has a defense. So now we have to look at knight e4. Well, now you're attacking the knight twice, just like you were before. That means that white can't guard it. You know, if white could guard it with a pawn, he would only lose a pawn, but he can't guard it with a pawn. But if he guards it with a bishop, you just say, thank you very much for the knight. In fact, I would take it with the bishop so I could force some more trades since I'm up a piece. I could take it with the knight, of course, but I think taking with the bishop is slightly better. Doesn't matter either way, you're winning a piece. So we can't guard the knight. Well, you could argue and say, but if he moves the knight, he'll lose a whole rook. Well, that's true if he moves it anywhere but e4. But if he plays knight takes e4, he gets a knight, and then he loses a rook. If you're one of those players who miscounts in positions like this and says, oh, I can't move the knight because I'll lose the whole rook, then you're going to lose a lot more games than you should. You need to do what I call the counting tactic in this case for defensive purposes, to figure out what's the way I could lose the least material. If you move the knight to a random square and you lose a rook, well, sure, that's terrible. But if you instead say, well, I can't move the knight because I'll lose the rook, and you play a move like bishop to b2 and then let him trade off, then you're losing an entire piece. That's a lot. The right thing to do is say thank you for the knight, give up the rook, and now you're only losing the exchange. Losing the exchange is a lot less than losing a piece. And not only that, white still has a pawn for it. Remember, he was up a pawn to begin with. So he's down the exchange, which is worth about 1 3/4 pawns, 2 pawns if you use the Reinfeld values. But at least he's got that knight and the pawn for the rook, and he shouldn't resign this position. He could still play. If you play any other move than knight takes e4 here, you could pretty much resign. So yes, it's true, knight takes e4 does lose the rook, but you're getting a knight for it. So you're not losing a whole rook, you're losing the exchange. And losing the exchange is worth about half as much as losing an entire piece. So the way to take advantage of all these loose pieces and the seeds and the pin and all those things is for black to play knight to e4. And this is a fairly common tactic, to sacrifice a piece so that you can win material like this. So in this case, it's a pseudo-sacrifice. You're giving up a piece, but you're getting a rook, and white saved the pawn, but that's not enough. So knight e4. All right, let's look at another one. Go to my ICC library, number 155. Okay, black to play. All right, so if it's black to play, then the seeds have to be what's wrong with white's position. Well, the first thing we notice is that his knight is in a pin. So there's a pin on the F file, rook's pinning the knight to the queen. Also, the queen is hanging. The queen is on the same diagonal with the rook. The knight is guarded twice and it's attacked twice. Are there any other seeds for the white position? Well, there's one more seed. Let's take that last move back. There's one more seed. The seed is that this rook on a5 is a little awkwardly placed. He's trying to guard the knight along the 5th rank, but it might be easy to take away squares from the 5th rank. Now, making this more complicated is the fact that black also has seeds. One of the big seeds is that the knight can check the king and therefore get out of the pin. So, for instance, suppose black just tries to put more pressure on the knight. Let's say he plays a move like, I don't know, rook to d5. Just trying to trade off the guard and leave the knight in the pin. White might be able to play a move like knight checks. All right? And the problem here is the piece that's attacking the knight is able to be taken by the piece that was attacked on f4. So that you can't sacrifice the exchange to win the queen because the queen's the one that's going to recapture. And the king has to either move into discovered checks here, which are complicated, or play king to d8, which allows further checks. And now the queen might be able to get out once the king gets out of check. So even though rook d5 is a candidate move, in all of these candidates, we have to watch out for what happens if the knight checks on d6. So unlike the previous tactic, which was relatively straightforward, here black's got to watch out for white's defenses. White's going to get some defenses in most of the ideas. So what are all the ideas that could take advantage of the white seeds here? Well, we said one of the seeds is that the rook is having trouble guarding the knight. So that's why rook d5 was a candidate move, to try to block that. What else could we do? Well, we could block it with a pawn. We could play b5. Now again, white has the possibility of playing knight checks. And now we either have to, if we move the king to d8, he has more knight checks. If we move the king into a discovered attack, we have to watch out for discovered attacks. We can't just go to any old square like knight takes b5, because the discovered attack is rook takes f4. So we have to be careful. We have to move the knight back. Let's say we could try for a draw with knight f5. So if he goes back to here again, we could just repeat the position. That's a possibility, not necessarily forced. Okay, then there's a second idea white has here after b5. Besides playing knight check, he could just play rook takes a6, and when black takes the knight, white can just play, rook takes c6, and black can't run toward the queen side because the queen c7 check. So he has to run toward the king side. And now white could get the other rook into the attack with rook e1 check. So here white would have two pawns and be chasing the king around a little bit, and he'd have the knight in a pin. So maybe black's better, but white's getting compensation, or at least some compensation. So that's an idea. A third idea is just play the move b6. Now notice the pawns are guarding every square on the fifth rank except for e5, but if he plays rook e5, then knight takes e5 removes that guard anyway. So after b6, again, we have these ideas of knight d6 check, or we have the idea of rook takes a6, and if he takes on c5, maybe white can do some sort of check and try to get an attack. So we got to look at all these lines. We can't just play one of them and say, oh, well, that one is probably the answer, because unless the one line is way better than the other lines, it's not 100% clear which one black wriggles out on the most. So this is a black to play and win tactic, but it's not an easy one. And it's not easy. There's more than one move that might win, and maybe some moves win more easily than the others. So we could look in the book for the answer, but we have this tremendous engine, Stockfish 12. Let's ask Stockfish 12 what the top three moves are here for black and what the evaluations are. All right, Stockfish. Top three moves for black. Okay, number one at 22 ply, now 23 ply, is b6, and now b5 has become number one. It's a fight between b6 and b5. They both are hanging around -3. The third move, c5, which also blocks the rook on the fifth rank, which I didn't mention earlier, is number 3 at -1.75. So actually, b5 and b6 are almost equally good. Now, it's not a good puzzle when one answer is almost as good as the other if you're putting it in a book. But if you're doing a practical puzzle from a real game and you're not making up a position, and you say, here's a real game, what should black play? Then it's understandable that black might have two lines that are almost equally good. And your job when you're playing the game is to see if you can differentiate whether one is a lot better than the other. Because if it is, maybe it's a lot easier to win the game with one than the other. On the other hand, if it turns out that they're both close, your job a little bit is to find out that at least they're close enough that you want to pick the one that you feel most comfortable with. So that's what Stockfish is saying here. He's saying b6 and b5 are both good. Let's take a look at the best lines for both players in both lines, and we'll call it a day. So let's look at the b6 line first. Let's go down to top move b6. It says white's best move is to counterattack the rook that's hanging on d3 with queen e4, which also double attacks the pawn on c6. Black should play the amazing move king d8. Wouldn't have guessed that. Now if queen takes d3, b takes a5, and the knight's still pinned. So it says white should play queen takes c6. Boy, this would be hard to find. Now rook takes f5. Queen a8 check. King c7. Rook takes a6. Rook on f to d5. Queen a7 check. King d8. If queen a8 check, king e7. If rook e1 check, then rook e5 is plus 3.7 for black. Well, that's not easy. Okay, but that's what happens in real games. You know, it's not so cut and dried. So that's the b6 line. Let's look at the second best move, b5, or almost tied for best move. Now it gives knight d6 check, king to b8, going into a discovery, but there's no double check. So if you move the knight back to f5 and try to get a draw, he goes to this square instead of this square. And now if you keep repeating the position, he'll bring the king up and attack the rook. Now he's attacking the rook. Well, the knight's not unguarded, but you have to watch out, and the rook's attacking the queen. So it now gives knight c4 check. It says black can win with either king b7 or b takes c4. B takes c4, queen takes c4, hitting the rook. And now black cannot take the rook because it's mate in 1. So what black should do, of course the rook on d3 is guarded by the queen on h7. So black can simply play rook a8, guarding that pawn on a6. And if queen b4 check, king c7, queen f4 check, rook can pin itself with rook d6. If rook d1, hitting the pinned rook. Queen h6, getting out of the pin and offering a trade of queens when he's up a knight. And Stockfish says black's ahead by about -3. So again, not easy. Not easy finding the best defense, not easy finding the best offense, but that's the way things are in practical positions. And that's what you do when you do a video. You work your way up from the easy examples up to the harder examples. And this is a more practical example. So let's go back to the original position. Let's turn off Stockfish, make the board bigger. Okay, so here it's black to play and win. It turns out he's got 2 moves that give him about a -3, which is certainly enough to win with best play. Neither of them are easy, but they're all based on the seeds. What are the seeds? Seed number 1, knight is pinned. Seed 2, it's only barely adequately guarded. It's attacked twice and guarded twice. Seed number 3, the rook on a5 is removable. How's it removable? Black can take away the 5th rank. Black can block the 5th rank. Black can block the 5th rank. Black can block the 5th rank. The real question is, which is the best way to do it? And it turns out that it's either b6 or b5. Even though that creates new seeds in the black position, that creates weaknesses around his king, it turns out he can survive those weaknesses, but it's not that easy. All right, well, as I said at the start of the video, I already made this video once before, and each video is like half an hour. So I've been talking for the last hour, and I've been talking about the same things twice. So I think I've had about enough. And if you enjoyed today's video, please tell your friends. That's the #1 thing you can do about the videos. Tell them about my channel. You can subscribe to the channel, and of course you can always like the video as well. Any of those things are appreciated. Thanks for the help. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you missed the first video on Seeds of Tactical Destruction, you want more, I had one that I made a few months ago. Just go to the channel and look for Seeds of Tactical Destruction. All right, talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.